we flew into Buenos Aires, and then from there flew to Mendoza. And I remember getting to Mendoza, I was surprised by how small the airport was. It was quite small, and also by how similar the climate was to like my home, because I'm from southeastern Washington, which is a desert area, and Mendoza was also very dry and brown. And then we went to the mission office and got our trainers, and I remember taking a 3-hour bus ride or something to my first area, which was in San Juan, an area called Posito. And I just remember being very disoriented and not quite knowing where I was, like which way was north and things like that. I remember my first days in the mission, I felt very cold. Our apartment wasn't super insulated, so I would always study like right next to the little, not a fireplace, but like a gas heater, I guess. And other memories from early on, a lot of mangy dogs. And also some memories of trying to, I guess, to understand the people, because the way that people spoke was different from the Spanish that we had learned in the MTC. And that I had also taken some high school Spanish, but like it was different and it was hard to understand. But fortunately, the people of San Juan speak fairly slow, so I was able to start understanding before too long. The growing of grapes is an important part of the culture, so they have these various festivals and things. And there's an event that's kind of like a junior miss competition, where people from each department, and this is in the province of Mendoza itself, but each department, which is kind of like a county, there will be like a vendimia queen who like represents that province and then goes on to compete at a provincial level. Gauchos are another part of the culture. I think broadly across all of Argentina. I think it's more common in the north in areas like Salta. But like there's just kind of a respect for cowboys and their horses. In parades, they will often have many horses. In the Vendimia parade of Mendoza, are something like 3,000 horses. It's something that's important to them, I guess, kind of like our cowboy stories here, but I think it's more integral to the culture of Argentina from what I saw. The Argentines are a proud people. They're proud of who they are, and sometimes at the expense of the neighboring countries. There's a little bit of enmity between Argentina and Bolivia, or rather, Argentines kind of look down on Bolivians sometimes, and there's a rivalry between Argentina and Chile, which is interesting because there are a number of Chileans living in Argentina and they would always be complaining about how Chile was better. But I mean, I love Argentine, so I was on the Argentine side. One other thing to mention about the language, I mentioned that like the double L and the Y have either a j or a y sound. In San Juan, they can't roll their R's, or don't roll their R's. And so it's more of like so instead of perro, it would be like percho. So that's an interesting feature to get used to. And San Juaninos also have a very sing-songy voice, like que bonito, mira el pechito. They're just very sing-songy and very cute. It's less that way in Mendoza. There's still a bit of a sing-song to the voice, but not as pronounced. Another part of the culture would be the food, which is quite good. I'm a fan of Argentine food. It has elements of a Mediterranean diet, but has its own twist to it. One common food that's quite good is empanadas, which is like, I guess it differs from region to region. I've heard that in the north they use like potatoes in them, but where I was, it was like these little pieces of flour and you wrap meat inside them and fold them over into a crescent. Sometimes it will have olives or onions in it as well. Milanesas are another thing, which is just like a bit of fried meat. Meat has been an important part of the Argentine diet for quite some time, and it used to be the case that that was like the cheapest thing to get, so people would barbecue all the time. In recent times there's been some economic difficulty, and so meat has become more expensive and less common. I'd say the foods that we ate the most were probably noodles, just various kinds of noodles, sometimes with meat in them, often accompanied by a salad, which was just tomatoes with lettuce and vegetable oil poured on top of it, which was quite good. Actually, I never liked tomatoes until I went to Argentina, and then like, whoa, these are good. So that was a good experience. Some of the more affluent people will have fruit more often, but that was less common among most people. There are a lot of good pastries and dessert breads in Argentina, called facturas in some places, which also means receipt in some other places, so it can be a little confusing. So just, I guess, little pieces of bread that are sugared or have some sort of sweetener in them. With each meal, like bread is served, just like little bread rolls, and that's used to like scoop up the last bits of food, or like if you're having soup, to like kind of clean up the plate. And that's something that I miss. That was really fun to be able to eat that way. I still do that occasionally. Generally, where I was, the church organization was not quite as developed as some other places. Often there wasn't a ward council or like anything to like really work with, so you can't necessarily do things by the book. But it's important to like try to work with members, and they're generally willing and helpful. In like some places are branches that are like really small. I remember one branch where I think my last Sunday there were 6 members. There were 12 people there, but the others were like missionaries and people from the stake, but just 6 people from the ward itself. There are other places where it's a little more developed. I think the biggest ward I was in at one point had I think 84 people in sacrament meeting, and that was like the most I had ever experienced there. I think there were other wards in the mission that had a little bit more, but generally they were like small branches or wards that were the size of branches. There is a lot of inactivity, and just people who had joined the church and are generally like friendly to missionaries, but just for one reason or another don't feel a strong desire to go back to church or don't feel the motivation. So there's a lot of work to be done with helping less active members become reactivated, and in doing so, perhaps being able to find their friends or some of their kids who didn't grow up with the gospel and helping them learn the gospel as well. So, as in most places, working with the members is probably the most effective way to do missionary work. Usually, like the stereotype that people think of when they think of Argentina is based on Buenos Aires, and Mendoza doesn't really fit that very closely. Often people think of the Argentine accent using the strong sh, like the sh sound on the double L and the Y, which doesn't happen in Mendoza. It's more like the double L and the Y would be more like of a j sound or a y, depending on the person. Mendoza is at about the same latitude as Buenos Aires, but it's on the west side of the country. So just in the foothills of the Andes Mountains, on the border with Chile. And it's a very dry climate for the most part. It gets fairly hot in the summers and fairly cold in the winters. It includes 3 provinces, which are Mendoza, and then just to the north of that, San Juan, and to the east of those 2 is San Luis. San Luis is, I think, more humid. I never was in San Luis, so I can't speak from experience as to what San Luis is like. That region is called Cuyo, like C-U-Y-O, There's a bit of influence of like indigenous peoples there in the naming of places, but most people are descendants of Europeans, as is the case in most of Argentina, where most people are descended from Italians, which makes it cool because it's like speaking Spanish with an Italian accent. The region of the Mendoza Mission is very agricultural. There are a lot of vineyards. They grow olives. There's a lot of those are kind of the main industries of the region, and that's a big part of the culture too. They have the Vendimia festival, which like celebrates the harvest of grapes. There were a lot of really pretty scenes. In most areas, you could see the mountains, and the mountains were quite beautiful. For like preparation days and things, we were encouraged to go check out, I guess, tourist attractions and things just to learn more about the culture. And places that we would often go were like dams, where you'd have like just this beautiful reservoir with like a little park next to it in the middle of the desert. So it's just like this nice little oasis. And then also we would often just like hike up hills and mountains. There are places where there are a lot of little cactus or cacti. They're about that big, so you kind of have to step very delicately so as to avoid stepping on them. But some really beautiful scenes. Some of them, particularly in San Juan, reminded me of, I guess, some of the pictures that you see of Jerusalem, or like paintings of Jesus like looking down at Jerusalem. There are places that are reminiscent of that. There are a couple of rivers, but not really. Just small rivers, or rivers that are like channeled through concrete in the middle of the cities. Another thing to know is about the acequias, which are like little ditches that are at the side of the street. And those go through most settled areas. Sometimes acequias can be quite rancid. Though usually, like in the cities, it's not too bad. Sometimes out in rural areas, they can be pretty filthy. But especially with the mountains, there are just some incredibly gorgeous areas and really pretty views to look at. One thing that's interesting about Argentina is how creative the graffiti is. And there's a lot in the cities, people will be just quite creative and have like a bit of a wry sense of humor. One common theme was flying pigs, just on the walls in the cities. It's these, I guess, pigs flying around, and that was quite lovely. Sometimes with the slogan "La culpa no es del chancho," like it's not the pig's fault, which I think was some political slogan, but I'm not sure exactly what it meant. And there was, in one area, there's a wall that is like broken in the middle, and on one end of the wall it has like the last half of like this big dinosaur lizard, and then at the break in the wall it has it like all bloody, as if the dinosaur had been like smashed in half by the wall breaking, and then like the rest of the dinosaurs on the other side. There's another bit of graffiti where Darth Vader is kneeling before Jesus and saying like, "I'm sorry." Just a lot of really interesting and creative graffiti. Another feature is that there are a lot of street vendors, people who will be selling watches or chorizo, which is like a sausage sandwich thing, or choripan, which has chorizo in it. It's important to know some of the history to understand why certain places, and particularly streets, are named the way they are. In most cities, you'll have the same series of street names. Things like Sarmiento, who was actually, I think he was from San Juan, but was like an early important political figure in Argentina and an educational reformer. And then a lot of streets will have date names, or will be named for dates, and those dates will be important events in Argentine history. There are a number of earthquakes, so that's part of the history, because it's in the mountains. And so in the main cities of both Mendoza and San Juan, there have been significant earthquakes that destroyed large parts of the city at various points in the past. As to church history, Elder Scott of the Quorum of the 12 was mission president in Cordoba, which is a little bit northwest of the Mendoza Mission. And at that time, it included what is now the Mendoza Mission. The Mendoza Mission was formed in 1990. I think the gospel started being preached in Argentina in 1925. I think Melvin K. Ballard came in and dedicated the land for the preaching of the gospel. Or at least he was there. Maybe he wasn't the one who dedicated it. One important historical thing to know is that Argentines and Brits are not particularly fond of each other because of the Falkland Islands War in 1982, and that is a subject to steer away from. It in Spanish, it's the Islas Malvinas, not the Falkland Islands, and they are Argentine, not British. So if that subject ever comes up, it's very good to try to get away from it as soon as possible, because it's very sensitive. Another subject to be careful with is the Perones, as people either love or hate them. People have strong feelings about the Perones. So that's a bit of history to be aware of, just so as not to step on people's toes. With transportation, we generally used buses to get around. I probably didn't live in about half of my areas, and we would just ride a bus there every day. And then also getting around the area, we would ride buses. So there was a fairly well-developed mass transit system. And people would also sell things on the buses. They would get up at the front of the bus and announce that they were selling like 20 DVDs for like 10 pesos. So like obviously pirated. And we would occasionally get at the front of the buses too, to just to announce ourselves as missionaries and see if anyone was interested. So I guess in the areas where I was, it generally wasn't too dangerous. Like it's a fairly safe area. You have to be cautious. So I mean, it's important to follow the safety guidelines in the handbook. There are places that are a bit more dangerous. In some places where I lived, where you just had to be quite vigilant and it's important to, I guess, listen to the locals as to what places you should be careful to go in. Though it's also important to take that with a grain of salt, because sometimes the locals are a bit paranoid and just don't trust like certain people, and so they'll say that a place is dangerous when it's really fine. The only time that I actually got robbed on the mission was by an ATM. So I didn't actually get robbed by a person. Though there were a couple of times when I almost got robbed, but due to us noticing things, it turned out all right. There was one time when we were coming back from our area to the town where we lived, and my companion was talking with some people on the bus and noticed that they weren't really paying attention to what he was saying, but were trying to act like they were. And then when we got off the bus, they suddenly hurried and got off the bus too. And so my companion became suspicious that they were wanting to rob us, so he pointed that out to me, and then we kind of just took a different route home and like hid behind some bushes while they sent the word on to the next street that, we had gone that way, and but that it ended up turning out all right just because we were aware of it. In that same area, but a different part of it, there was a time we were starting to walk out away from a settled area to the middle of nowhere, and then I noticed like 2 people starting to follow us and became suspicious as to their intentions. So I just pointed it out to my companion. We just walked back to the settled area, and it turned out to be fine. But there were missionaries in my mission who had a little bit more rough experiences. But generally, it's a pretty safe place, just as long as you're cautious and obey the rules. Okay. But one thing that I learned in the mission is that you should always take the advice of members with a grain of salt. At one point, I was on exchanges with another missionary, and we stopped by the house of some less active members, and they weren't super receptive, but at the end of the visit, we asked if any of their neighbors might be interested in learning about the gospel, and we saw some of their neighbors coming into their house right at that time, and we asked about them. They're like, "Oh no, they're terrible people. They wouldn't be interested." And we're just like, "No, they're not." And so we left the members and went to that house and started teaching that family, and just had a really great experience teaching that family. It was a family that had a lot of trials, a lot of hardship, and they didn't end up being baptized while I was there. They got close a couple of times, and there were a lot of really special experiences with that family. But I guess there are people who are ready to hear the gospel despite what members might say. And I guess one thing that it brought to mind is when the Book of Mormon talks about the sons of Mosiah wanting to go preach to the Lamanites, and the Nephites mocking them and being like, "Well, how are you going to teach them that they're not going to accept the gospel?" So I guess a good thing to know is to not always take members' word for it when they say that someone's not going to accept the gospel. Probably one of my favorite and most stressful teaching experiences happened in Colonia Segovia, where we went and just stopped by this house, and the mother of the house let us in, and we were just out in her yard, just talking with her and a friend about the gospel, and they had been very strong Seventh-day Adventists, but had just left that church a couple months earlier over a dispute with how a member was treated. And she was very knowledgeable about the Bible and had a lot of questions and doubts about Seventh-day worship, or rather about us going to church on Sunday rather than Saturday. And we just tried the go-to scriptures from Acts and things, and those didn't quite do the trick. So it was that required a lot of intense study and just really trying to do what we could to reach her. And at one point during a lesson with her, I felt like we should invite her to be baptized for a particular date. And I thought that the date was a little far away, but that's what I felt that I should invite her to do. And so we invited her to be baptized on that date, and then she was just shocked. Well, that's so early. How can I be baptized that early? I studied in my last church for 2 years before being baptized. And I was just thinking well, why did I feel prompted to invite her to be baptized on that specific day? And then I ended up leaving the area, and my companion continued to teach her. And eventually found out that, she told me later, she's like, "Do you remember when you invited me to be baptized on that day?" I'm like, "Yeah, I remember." And she's like, "Well, that's not the day I was baptized, but that's the day that I knew I needed to be baptized." And so it was just really neat to have that experience, and just that confirmation that there's a reason that we feel the promptings we do, even if it seems to turn out terribly right at first. And so I was able to go visit that area later when she was baptized. And so that was a really special experience, to just be able to see her progress. And then her husband was so upset with what had happened in their last church that he had said that he would never set foot in any church ever again. And during the time I was there, we interacted with him, and he was a very friendly guy. but we never like taught him because he wasn't interested. But then after I left, he started, like to support his wife, he went to her baptism, and then later he started going to church with her, and then later he decided to be baptized too. And they've since been sealed, I believe, and have become temple workers. So that was just really neat to see how they went from like having a lot of doubts about the church to like being temple workers. One thing that I learned on the mission was the importance of focusing like personal and companionship study on investigators and seeking answers to their questions and trying to receive revelation as to how best to help them. And by having that kind of directed study, it helped, I guess, our studies be a lot more fulfilling and productive. So in my first area, we had a hard time getting people to progress. It was a place where people were very open to receiving us, but not particularly open to like doing anything about it. And in my second transfer there, like we still hadn't baptized anyone. And we were working with a member and like encouraging her to give us referrals, like to refer us to her friends. And she was a bit reluctant about it, but finally referred us to her friend Maria. And we went to visit Maria, and when we went to her door, she seemed not incredibly pleased to see us. But then we mentioned the name of her friend, and she just suddenly brightened up and was like, "Oh, come in." And so we started teaching Maria, and so over the course of time, she finally started coming to church. I think one anecdote which reflects something of the Argentine character is we told her that, okay, so church, like just trying to get her ready for church, and like church starts at 9, so what time will you need to be up to be able to get ready for that? She's like, 10:30. And so we found that kind of amusing. But she ended up going to church and continuing to go to church. One really special experience with her was I forget which lesson we were teaching, but a question came up about the word of wisdom, which we hadn't taught yet. And we just mentioned briefly what it was without like really going in depth teaching it. We were going to like teach the full lesson the next time. And then the next time we saw her, we found out she had already given up drinking coffee, even though we hadn't like really taught the lesson. We just mentioned that it was something that we didn't partake of. So it was really neat to see her faith in that instance. And then she ended up being baptized a few weeks later. And so it was really neat to see how the value that there was in having her friend refer her to us and her friend be there to support her and to help her in her transition to becoming a new member. And I think most of the successful stories or successful teaching experiences with investigators came with the help of members, and with members, even if members didn't refer us to them, with members helping in the teaching, or members being there to fellowship people like when they came to church. So that is a really important part of missionary work. Congratulations on your call to Mendoza. It's a wonderful place, a wonderful mission. I really enjoyed my time there. I was grateful to be able to serve in the provinces of Mendoza and San Juan. And it will be a great opportunity for you. My advice would be to go in with an open mind and be willing to seek to understand the people and to know, I guess, why they believe what they believe. Seek to be empathetic. And be open to, I guess, cultural things that are different from what you're used to. Because there may be some things that at first you might think are wrong because they're different from your experience. But really it's just different. And there is a lot that you can learn from the people of Mendoza and San Juan. And I love the people of that region, and I'm, like I said, eternally grateful for the opportunity I had to get to know them. working with the members is always a good thing. So as I know that as you seek to follow the Spirit and to obey mission rules and to do your best to reach out to people and to help them feel the love of Christ, that you will have a successful mission. And I share that testimony with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.